Maigret and a Spinster by George Simenon. Part 2, Chapter 1.
Was there an epidemic of some sort in Berger? Maigret could easily have found out, but, the question having once crossed his mind, he gave no further thought to it. The undertaker's man would no doubt have told him that deaths occur in waves, that sometimes 5 days would go by with not a single hearse, either of the luxury or of the plainer variety, being taken out on the road, and that this lull might be followed by a period of hectic demand. On this particular morning, the undertaker's resources were fully stretched, so much so that one of the 2 horses harnessed to Juliette Boynet's hearse was not trained for the job, and 10 times at least attempted to break into a trot, thus imparting a somewhat jerky and hasty tempo to the procession, not at all in keeping with the funeral dignity of the occasion. The arrangements for the funeral had been undertaken by a man named Monfils, an insurance agent from Luçon. No sooner had the press reported the murder of Juliette Boynet than he turned up in Paris, dressed in deep mourning, and from then on this tall, thin, wan figure, sporting a red nose as a result of a cold caught on the train, was very much to the fore at all times. He was Juliette Boynet's first cousin. I know what I'm talking about, Chief Superintendent. It was understood from way back that she would leave us something, and she agreed to stand godmother to our eldest child. I'm sure there must be a will in existence. If none has been found, it may be that there are those who have an interest in causing it to disappear. What's more, I intend to register my claim with the court. He had insisted on a grand funeral with all the trimmings, including the setting up of a memorial chapel in the apartment on the 5th floor, and the departure of the procession from the funeral parlor. We are not in the habit in our family of burying our dead on the cheap. This very morning he had been to the station to collect his wife, also in deep mourning, and his 5 sons, all with unruly fair hair, who were now following the coffin, each carrying his hat in descending order of size. The traffic was at its heaviest on the main roads at this time of day, trucks mostly returning from the central market in endless file, nose to tail. It was a clear, sunny day, but there was a sharp nip in the air. People were stamping their feet and keeping their hands in their pockets. Maigret had not had any sleep the previous night. He had sat up with Lucas, keeping watch on his gang of Poles in the room overlooking Rue de Birague. During the past 3 days, ever since Cécile's death, he had been gloomy and irritable. He was beginning to lose patience with the Poles, who were preventing him from giving his whole mind to the Berger murders. By 7 o'clock in the morning, his mind was made up. You wait here. I'm going to pinch the first one to come out. Watch it, Chief. They're armed. He shrugged, went into the Hôtel des Arcades, mounted the stairs, and waited. A quarter of an hour later, the bedroom door opened. A giant of a man went to the stairs. Maigret flung himself upon him from behind, and the 2 men rolled over and over together until they reached the ground floor. At last, having managed to fasten handcuffs on his quarry, the chief superintendent got up. He blew his whistle, and Inspector Torrance came running. Take him to the quay. I'll leave the job of grilling him to you. Keep at it till he talks. Understood? Take it in relays if necessary. I want a full confession. He dusted himself down and then went into a bar and had croissant and coffee laced with brandy at the counter. Everyone in the police judiciaire knew that, at times like these, it was wiser not to cross him. Madame Maigret, for her part, dared not even ask him what time he would be home for his meals. There he stood on the sidewalk, with his back to the window of the grocer's, looking sullen and smoking his pipe in little angry puffs. The press had written up the case, and there was a small crowd of spectators, not to mention 6 reporters and 1 or 2 photographers. The 2 hearses were drawn up in front of the house, first Juliette Boynet's and then Cécile's. Madame, saving your presence, saying that it was the least they could do, had organized a collection among the tenants for a wreath. to our landlady, who will be sadly missed. Beside the Monfils, representing the family of Juliette Boynet, née Casanov, there was another group representing the deceased husband, the Boynet and the Machepier, who lived in Paris. The two rival factions glowered at one another. Boynet and the Machepier also claimed that they had been robbed, saying that the old woman had promised, after her husband's death, that part of her fortune would one day revert to his relations. They had turned up in force the previous night in police headquarters, and, as they were persons of some standing, one of them being a city councillor, had been received by the chief commissioner himself. Tell me, Maigret, these gentlemen claim that there is a will. I've told them again and again that the apartment has been thoroughly searched, but it makes no difference. They had a grudge against Maigret. They had a grudge against Monfils. They had a grudge against Juliette. In other words, everyone felt cheated. Gérard pardon most of all. He spoke not a word to anyone, and looked more distraught than ever. Having no money, he had not been able to afford mourning clothes. Instead of an overcoat, he wore an old khaki mackintosh with a black armband. His sister Bertha kept close to him, troubled at seeing him so agitated. She was a plump little thing, pretty and well-groomed. She had not thought it necessary to buy a dark hat instead of a cherry-red confection she was wearing. Monsieur d'Anduron was also present, accompanied by 4 or 5 very self-assured gentlemen, all expensively dressed and wearing numerous flashing rings, who had turned up in a sumptuous limousine. The Sivachis, too, were there in force, except for the mother, who was still in bed. Madame Piechot, the grocer, had left Madame Benoît in charge of the shop for a few minutes while she went upstairs and sprinkled holy water on the coffins. The undertaker, who was anyway on edge because he had another funeral at 11, could not make head or tail of the various factions, and was quite unable to ascertain who was representing the family officially, and the presence of the photographers was an added cause for alarm. Wait a minute, gentlemen, I beg you. Can't you at least wait until the procession has formed? The last thing he wanted was a photograph of a chaotic procession in the papers. Fingers were pointed at Maigret, but he appeared not to notice. As the 2 coffins were being brought out, he touched Gérard Pardon on the shoulder. The young man gave a start. "Could you spare me a minute?" he whispered, taking him aside. "What do you want this time?" "Your wife must have told you that I called on her yesterday while you were out. You don't mean you've been searching our hovel?" He sniggered. It was a painful, grating sound. "Did you find what you were looking for?" And when the chief superintendent replied that he had, Pardon stared at him in horror. "Believe it or not, when your wife just happened to have her back to me, I took the liberty of digging my fingers into a flower pot. I'm a bit of a gardener in my spare time, you see, and there was something about those flowers that didn't look right to me. And look what I found buried in the recently disturbed soil." He held out his hand, in the palm of which lay a small key, the key to the front door of Juliette Boynet's apartment. "Odd, don't you think?" he went on. "And here's a coincidence. When I returned to my office a little while later, I found there was a locksmith waiting to see me, a locksmith who lives not 100 yards from here, and who wished to inform me that he had cut a key similar to this one less than a fortnight ago." "What does that prove?" Gérard was trembling. He looked about him wildly, as though in search of help, and his glance rested on his sister's coffin being hoisted into the hearse by the men in black. "Are you going to arrest me?" "I don't know yet. If you question the locksmith, he must have told you that I got that key. He had got it from Cécile. The locksmith's statement had established that beyond doubt. On Monday, September 25th, he had stated, a young woman of about 30 came into my workshop, produced a Yale key, and asked me if I could make her a copy. I said I would need the original key to work from. She objected that it was her only key, and that she would be needing it, so I made a wax impression. Next day, she came to collect a new key, and paid me 12 francs 75 centimes. It was only when I read in the papers that Cécile Pardon had been murdered, and in particular when I learned from her description that she had a slight squint, that The procession was beginning to move. The master of ceremonies bustled up to Gérard, waving his arms. Maigret whispered, "We'll talk later." Gérard and his sister Bertha were placed immediately behind the hearses, but they had not gone 10 yards before Monfils, disputing their rights of precedence, came forward to join them. The Boinet and the Machepier, less officious, scorned any hypocritical show of grief and followed behind, deep in discussion regarding the succession. Monsieur d'Anduhon and the gentleman of the flashy rings came next, all except one, who brought up the rear of the procession, driving the big car. From the start, an account on the temperamental horse, the pace was distinctly brisk. When the time came, however, to turn left off the main road for the church, there was a fearful snarl-up. All traffic was brought to a halt for several minutes, including 3 streetcars in a row. In view of her condition, Gérard's wife was not present. Her confinement was due within a week or less. Maigret had spent an hour with her the previous night in their lodgings, comprising 2 rooms over a butcher's shop on Rue de Pas de la Mue. She was barely 23 years of age, yet her face was not youthful, but aged with the resignation of the poor. It was plain to see that she had tried, with all the inadequate means at her command, to make the 2 rooms habitable. Some of her possessions had no doubt already found their way to the pawnshop. Maigret noticed that the gas had been cut off. Gérard has always been unlucky, she sighed without rancor. And yet he has many virtues. He is a great deal more intelligent than many others who have good jobs. Maybe that's his trouble? Her name was Eileen. Her father was working for a credit company. She had been too scared to let him know how things really stood in her house, and had led him to believe that Gérard was working, and that the marriage was a happy one. He may seem somewhat aggressive to you, but look at it from his point of view. Lately, everything has gone against him. He's out from morning till night, answering advertisements for jobs. Surely you don't regard him as a suspect. He's the soul of honesty. Maybe it's just because he's so scrupulously honest that he's a failure. Let me give you an example. In his last job, he worked in a shop selling vacuum cleaners. There was a break-in. Gérard suspected that one of his fellow employees was involved. He said nothing, but later the boss subjected him to a barrage of questions, making Gérard feel that he himself was under suspicion, and rather than involve anyone else, Gérard gave notice. "Oh, by all means make a thorough search. You won't find anything of interest here except bills." And the flower pot on the windowsill. Maigret had noticed that the soil had been recently disturbed, although the geranium planted in it had long since died. While Hélène's attention was momentarily distracted, he had pounced. With his hands in his pockets, he strolled along the sidewalk on the edge of the procession and so felt free to smoke his pipe. At the tail end of the procession, he observed the 2 Siveshi girls, Nouchi and Potsi, who were treating it as a festive occasion and relishing every detail. Madame, saving your presence, had left her lodge in charge of a neighbor for an hour or so, unaware that Maigret had posted an inspector on guard outside the building. She would be attending the service in the church, but not the burial. She was sensitive to drafts, on account of her stiff neck. Suddenly the column came to an unscheduled halt. They all craned their necks and stood on tiptoe to find out what was happening. Juliette Boinet and Cécile were victims of an unfortunate mischance. As their procession, which was running early, reached a crossroads, another funeral procession, this one running late, emerged from a side road and made for the church. There was no alternative but to wait. The horses stamped their feet. Several of the men left the column to go in search of a drink, and were seen a few minutes later coming out of a little cafe nearby, wiping their mouths. Organ music could be heard, and behind, cars rumbling past on the Route Nationale 20. The priest galloped through the service at top speed, and it was not long before the church doors were flung wide open. Et nos inducas in tentationem, and do not lead us into temptation. The master of ceremonies, in a cocked hat, ran back and forth alongside his flock like a sheepdog. Se libera nos en malo, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Before the first lot had all come out, Juliette Bonnet's mourners began entering the church. There was room for only one of the two coffins on the bier. Cécile's was set down at the back on the tiled floor. Libera nos Domine, Lord deliver us, chanted the priest. There was a creaking of shoes, a scraping of chairs. A cool breeze blew in through the wide open door at the back, beyond which could be seen the sunlit street. Gérard, in the front row, looked restlessly about him. Was it Maigret he was searching for? Charles d'Andurand's companions, conducting themselves very correctly, dropped 100-franc notes into the poor box. Bertha, conspicuous in her cherry-red hat, watched her brother anxiously, as if she feared he might do something foolish. Pater Noster, Our Father. The magnesium flare of an agency photographer suddenly flashed, causing everyone to start. Maigret, huddled in his heavy overcoat with the velvet collar, was leaning against a stone pillar, his lips moving as if in prayer. And, indeed, he might well have been praying for poor Cécile, who had sat waiting for him so long in the aquarium at the Quai des Orfèvres. For the past 3 days, his colleagues had scarcely dared address a word to him. Heavy and lowering, he went to and fro in the building, chewing the stem of his pipe and brooding furiously. No progress, the chief had inquired the previous night. His only reply had been a look so miserable and baffled that it spoke louder than words. It's no good fretting, my dear fellow. You're bound to get a lead soon. The apostles in the stained-glass windows glowed in the sunlight. Maigret's glance, for no apparent reason, kept returning to the figure of Saint Luc, whom the artist had portrayed with a square brown beard. Et ne nos inducas in tentationem, and lead us not into temptation. The priest was rushing through the service at such speed as to suggest that there was another funeral procession champing at the door. The horse that had not been properly trained in funeral procedures kept whinnying every few minutes, and a sound, re-echoing under the stone vaults, seemed like a joyful affirmation of life. What could have induced Cécile to have an extra key to the apartment cut without her aunt's knowledge a fortnight ago? Was it she who had given it to her brother? If so, he could see her still, motionless in the waiting room with her handbag on her lap, prepared to sit there for hours, not moving a muscle. Maigret recalled his own thoughts. Either she was called away by someone she knew and trusted, or she was led to believe that she was being taken to see me. Her brother? Gérard had never taken his eyes off him during the whole of the service. Every now and then Bertha would pat his arm to reassure him. Embarrassed, the chief superintendent avoided the young man's gaze. This way, gentlemen. Hurry along, please. At the cemetery, too, there was a great deal of bustle that day. They hastened past the family mausoleums and individual stone monuments, and before long had reached the new section with its slabs of clay surmounted by wooden crosses. The two coffins were hoisted onto trolleys and wheeled along the narrow pathways, followed by the mourners walking in single file. Might I have a word with you, Chief Superintendent? When would be convenient? Where are you staying? At the L'Hôtel de Saintes, on Boulevard Montparnasse. It was Monfils, who had caught up with Maigret as they made their way to the graveside. I'll probably look in on you sometime today. Wouldn't you rather I came to your office? I don't know what my schedule will be. And Maigret hurried forward to catch up with Bertha, who had been temporarily separated from her brother in the crowd. You shouldn't let him out of your sight. He's terribly overwrought. Try to persuade him to go back with you to your place. I'll come and see him there. She assented with a flicker of her eyelashes. She was a pretty girl, a plump little creature, seeming infinitely remote from the dramatic events of the past few days. Excuse me, Chief Superintendent. Maigret turned to face one of Monsieur d'Andurand's friends. Could you spare me a minute or two? There's a quiet little bistro just across the road from the cemetery. Leading the procession was a deacon, attended by a small choir boy, who galloped along as fast as his short legs could carry him, in spite of his inconveniently long black skirt and heavy hobnail boots. Bending over the open grave, the deacon turned the pages of his prayer book, then, his lips still moving, flung the first spadeful of earth on the coffins. Gérard and his cousin Monfils held up their hands simultaneously. There were too many heads in the way for Maigret to see which of them managed to get in first. Suddenly, the gathering broke up in disorder. Nouchi bustled across the chief superintendent and subjected him to a shameless stare. He would not have been surprised if she had asked him for his autograph, as she would a film star. The bistro stood in the middle of a monument mason's yard. When Maigret pushed open the door, he found Don Duhon's smart friends already seated at a table. They all stood up. "Forgive me for taking up your time like this. What will you have?" "Waiter, the same for the chief superintendent." Charles Don Duhon was there with them, smooth and grey as the tombstones. "Take a seat, chief superintendent. We would gladly have gone to your office, but maybe it's better." All the big bosses who were in the habit of foregathering every evening at Albert's place were there, every bit as self-possessed as a board of directors seated around a table covered in green baize. "Cheers! Let's not beat about the bush. Chief Superintendent Cassieux can vouch for us. He knows we are on the level." The big limousine was waiting at the gates, and a group of kids were clustered round it, admiring the chromium fittings that glinted in the sunlight. It's about poor Juliet, needless to say. As you know, the law, in its moral wisdom, does not recognize the legality of any transactions entered into in connection with our sort of enterprise. We have to manage as best we can among ourselves. The fact is that Juliet had a share in at least a dozen establishments, not counting those in Béziers and on Rue d'Antin, which she wholly owned. Monsieur Charles will tell you what we have met here to consider our position and future plans. The others nodded gravely. Monsieur Charles sat motionless, with his smooth, bloodless hands palms down on the table. "The same again, waiter. Do you appreciate what these enterprises represent, Chief Superintendent, in terms of hard cash? Something over 3,000 big ones. In other words, more than 3 million francs. Now, the last thing we want is trouble. Apparently, she didn't leave a will. Quite rightly, Monsieur Charles doesn't want any fuss. So we wondered if you could advise us as to how we should proceed. Monsieur Charles has already been approached by two fellows. First of all, there's that death's head, Monfils, who is here with his brood. And then there's the young lady's brother, the boy Gérard. They're after the money, the pair of them. Not that we are raising any objection, but at the same time we've got to know who legally gets the dough. Well, that's how matters stand at present. You must realize that one can't close down highly profitable establishments just because..." Abruptly, the speaker rose to his feet and took Maigret by the arm. "A private word with you, if you permit." He led Maigret into the room at the back. "I am what I am, and I don't pretend to be anything else. All the same, there's one point on which you can safely take my word and that of my colleagues, and that is that Monsieur Charles has always played straight. The old lady's papers have disappeared, but we're not the sort to niggle over a signature. I said 3 million. I could be underestimating. But, documents or no documents, no one is going to touch a penny until you give the word." "I'll have to consult with my superiors," replied Maigret. "One moment, there's something else, but it concerns my colleagues as much as myself." They returned to the larger front room. "Well, Chief Superintendent, here it is. We have decided to put 20 grand at your disposal to help in the search for the bastard who did old Juliet in. Is that all right? Is it enough? Are we agreed? Monsieur Charles will hand over the dough." The former lawyer, under the misapprehension that the time had come, drew from his pocket a wallet stuffed to bursting point. "Not now," said the chief superintendent, cutting him short. "I shall have to refer the matter." "Waiter, my bill." "Oh yes, I'm sorry, but I must insist." And as he paid for his drinks, the man who had appointed himself spokesman for the others grumbled. "As you prefer, if you don't like our club." Maigret went out of the bistro with a glow in his chest from having drunk 2 aperitifs. He had not gone 10 paces when he came to an abrupt halt. He found himself face to face with Gérard and his sister Bertha. Gérard was looking more distraught than ever. Bertha gave the chief superintendent a look which plainly said, "I did all I could to get him away. See for yourself. I can't do a thing with him." As for Cécile's brother, he had contrived to knock back a few drinks, and he reeked of spirits. With trembling lips and in a voice uncontrollably shrill, he shouted defiantly, "And now, Chief Superintendent, I'd be obliged if you would kindly explain yourself." The grave diggers were overwhelmed. They were needed elsewhere, and Cécile's coffin lay uncovered, except for a few spadefuls of yellow earth.
Rancor. Rancor. Noun. Bitterness or resentfulness, especially when long-standing. Maigret and the Spinster by George Simenon. Part 2, Chapter 2.
Go right in, my girl. It was certainly not in character, but Maigret, without realizing it, felt an urge to lay his hand on Bertha Pardon's plump shoulder. This sort of quasi-paternal response is common enough in elderly men, and seldom arouses comment. But the chief superintendent had no doubt been clumsy, because the girl turned around and stared at him in amazement, as if to say, "You too." He felt a little foolish. Her brother had preceded them into the apartment, which had been stripped only a few minutes before of its funeral draperies. They had encountered the deputy undertaker's men with their gear in the hall on their way up. Maigret was just about to follow the others inside when a voice with a slight foreign accent murmured in his ear, "Could I have a word with you, Chief Superintendent?" He recognized Nouchi, dressed for the funeral in a black suit several sizes too small and too tight for her. No doubt it had been made 2 or 3 years before her figure had reached maturity, and it accentuated her precocity. Later, he said irritably, he had no patience with this impudent chit. "It's very urgent, really it is." Maigret went into the late Juliette Boynet's apartment and said grumpily, as he shut the door, "Urgent or not, it will have to wait." Having got Gérard where he wanted him, he intended to straighten things out with him once and for all. That Bertha was there as well as all to the good, he felt. The old woman's apartment was a more suitable setting for this particular confrontation than his office at the Quai des Orfèvres. The atmosphere of the place was already having its effect on Gérard's nerves. He was gazing with a kind of anguish at the walls, so recently stripped of their black draperies, and breathing in the smell of candles and flowers, like the stale smell of death itself. As for Bertha Pardon, she was as much at home here as behind her counter at the Galeries Lafayette or in the little fixed-price restaurant where she usually had her meals. Her round face, still childlike, exuded serenity and that inner contentment which some believed to be the expression of an easy conscience. She seemed the very quintessence of girlhood, untouched not by sin only, but by the very notion of sin. "Sit down, my dears," said Maigret, taking his pipe out of his pocket. Gérard was far too tense to settle in one of the sitting-room armchairs. In marked contrast to his sister, he was on edge the whole time, his mind in a turmoil, his eyes never still. "Why don't you say straight out that you suspect me of having murdered my aunt and sister?" he asked, his lips trembling. "Just because I'm poor, and because I've always been dogged by ill luck, what do you care about upsetting my wife, who is expecting a child any moment now and who, anyway, has never been strong? You take advantage of my absence to go ferreting about in our lodgings. You made quite sure first that I would be out, didn't you?" "That's right," said Maigret, gazing at the pictures on the walls as he lit his pipe. "Because you had no search warrant, because you knew I would never have permitted it." "No, of course not." Bertha took off the fur piece she was wearing around her neck. It was a strip of pine marten, too long and too narrow. The chief superintendent was impressed by the whiteness and smoothness of her throat. "Have you so much as asked that phony Monfils where he was on the night of the murder? I'm quite sure you haven't, because he is. I intend to put that very question to him this afternoon. In that case, you can also ask him if it isn't true that my sisters and I have been cheated of our rights from start to finish." He pointed to a somewhat faded enlargement of a photograph of a woman. "That's my mother," he declaimed. "Cécile was very like her, not only in looks, but in character. You won't understand their sort of humility, their dread of stepping out of line, of taking more than their due, their unwholesome craving for self-sacrifice, That was what my poor sister was like, and she was a slave all her life. That's true, Bertha, isn't it? Quite true, agreed the girl. Aunt Juliet treated her like a servant. What the chief superintendent doesn't realize. Maigret had difficulty in suppressing a smile, for there was one thing that this seething young man could not see, and that was that he himself suffered from an inferiority complex. But that sense of inferiority irked him so much that, in order to shake it off, he went to the other extreme and adopted an aggressive and defiant posture. My mother was the older sister. She was 48 when my aunt met Benoît, who was a wealthy man. After their parents died, the two daughters lived together in Fontenay on the income they inherited jointly. Now, what happened was this. In order to marry Benoît, my aunt had to have a dowry, so she got my mother to agree to give up her share of the inheritance. Everyone in the family knows that, and unless he is a liar, Monfils will confirm it. So you see, it was thanks to my mother that Aunt Juliet was able to make such a good match. I'll make it up to you one day. You can rest assured that I'll never forget after I'm married. Not a penny. After she was married, she looked down on her sister as being too poor to be introduced to her grand new friends, so my poor mother had to go to work in a shop in Fontenay. She married one of the supervisors in the store. He was already in poor health, and she had to go on working. Then we were born, and the most that my aunt could be persuaded to do was to stand godmother to Cécile. And do you know what she sent her for her first communion? 100 francs. And she with a husband who already owned at least 10 apartment buildings. You have nothing to fear, Emily, she wrote to my mother. If anything should happen to you, I would take care of the children. First, my father died, and not long after, my mother. By then, Aunt Juliet was a widow, and she had recently moved to this apartment, though she occupied the whole floor in those days. It was our cousin Monfils who brought us from Fontenay. You won't remember, Bertha. You were too young. Good God, how skinny they are, exclaimed Aunt Juliet when she saw us. You'd think my poor sister had starved them. She was critical of everything about us. Our outer clothes and underwear, our worn shoes, our manners. As for Cécile, who was nearly grown up, she treated her like a servant from the start. She wanted to send me to trade school, saying that the poor should earn a living with their hands. If I came home with a tear in my trousers, I would never hear the end of it. I was an ungrateful brat. I didn't appreciate all that she was doing for me and my sisters. Mark her words, I would come to a wretched end. Cécile suffered in silence. The maid was fired. Why should she keep a servant, with my sister there to do all the work? Would you like to see the sort of clothes she made us wear? He went across to a cabinet and got a photograph of all three of them. Cécile was in black, as Maigret had known her hair unbecomingly drawn back into a tight knot. Bertha, plump as a puppy, in a dress too long for a child of her age, and Gérard, aged 14 or 15, wearing a suit that had certainly not been made to measure. I decided to enlist in the army, and she never sent me so much as a 5-franc piece to tide me over till the end of the month. My buddies used to get parcels from home, cigarettes and things. All my life, I've had to look on at what other people had. How old were you when you ceased to live with your aunt? Maigret asked, turning to the girl. 16, she replied. I applied all on my own for a job in a department store. They asked me my age, and I said I was 18. When I got married, Gérard went on, my aunt sent me a silver cake slicer. Later, when I was desperate for money, I sold it, and all I could get for it was 30 francs. Cécile barely got enough to eat, and yet our aunt was a rich woman. And now that she's dead, I'm the one who's being made to suffer. You're the same as all the rest. It was painful to look at him. He was so eaten up with bitterness and resentment. Were you never tempted to kill your aunt? Asked Maigret, so matter-of-factly that it gave the girl a start. If I said yes, that would be as good as telling you I strangled her, wouldn't it? Well, yes, I often wished her dead. Unfortunately, I'm too much of a coward. Well, there it is. You can think what you like. Arrest me, if that's what you want. It will only be the last of many injustices. Bertha glanced at the little wristwatch she was wearing. Can I be of any further use to you, Chief Superintendent? Why do you ask? It is lunchtime. My friend will be waiting for me outside the store. This reference to her lover did not detract from her air of virginal innocence. You have my address, 22 Rue Ordinaire. I'm nearly always at home in the evenings after 7, except when we go out to see a movie. What are you going to do with Gérard? He always carries on like this. You mustn't take him too seriously. Are you all right for money, Gérard? Give Eileen a kiss from me. Tell her I'll drop by and see her tomorrow or the day after. They've given me 3 days off at the store. On her way to the door, she turned and smiled at the two men before going out. And this is what we've come down to, concluded Gérard. Her boyfriend is a married man. If my poor mother... Tell me, why did Cécile give you this key? You really want to know? I'll tell you, but you're not going to like it. She gave it to me because the police weren't doing their job. Because when a poor person goes to them for help, they won't even listen. Cécile went to see you several times. Even you wouldn't dare deny that. She told you that she was frightened, that there was something going on in this apartment that she didn't understand. And what did you do? You made fun of her. You sent along an absurd little sergeant a couple of times who did nothing but pace up and down outside the house. When Cécile, by then convinced beyond any doubt that someone was getting into the sitting room at night, called on you again, she could sense that the whole apartment was having a good laugh at her expense, so much so that the inspectors took it in relays to go and peer at her in the waiting room. Maigret listened with bowed head. It was then that she had the key cut. She asked me, "Sorry to interrupt, where did you and your sister used to meet?" "In the street, when I needed to see her." "To ask her for money?" "Yes, to ask her for money. That's right. I dare say you're very pleased with yourself for having found that out." She did, in fact, occasionally slip me a few francs. It was never very much, just what she was able to scrape together, as they say, out of the housekeeping. I used to wait for her at the corner, when I knew she would be going out to do her shopping. Does that satisfy you? I'm only too happy to oblige. She gave me the key about 10 days ago. She asked me to check on the apartment from time to time at night to try and find out what was going on. And did you? No, I couldn't, on account of my wife. The doctor feared a premature confinement. I intended to look into it later. How would you have got into the building? Cécile had thought of everything. Every evening at 7 o'clock, the concierge goes upstairs with the mail. She always stops for a few minutes to chat with the Desaglises. They're the third-floor tenants in the apartment on the left. All I had to do was to slip in there. What about your aunt? Oh, what the hell. I know every word I say will be used against me. It's all too easy. Well then, here goes. My aunt suffered from pains in the legs, and every evening at about that time, she had hot air massage, which apparently relieved the pain. My sister used an electric dryer, like those one sees at the hairdressers. They make quite a lot of noise. All I had to do was let myself in with my key and go and hide under Cécile's bed. Are you satisfied? And now, if you don't mind, I'm hungry and my wife is expecting me home. You've scared her enough already, going to see her like that. If I'm not back soon, she'll think. So, unless you intend to arrest me here and now, I'll thank you to let me go. As for her money, which is ours by right, we'll see whether. He turned his head away, but not soon enough to prevent Maigret from seeing the tears of rage that were running down his cheeks. "You are at liberty to go," said the chief superintendent. "Is that so?" exclaimed the young man, with heavy irony. "So I'm not to be arrested just yet? You are too kind. How can I ever thank you?" Gérard was not sure that he had caught the words aright, but as he made for the door, he thought he heard Maigret say, "Silly ass." Was Nouchi still hoping to succeed in seducing the chief superintendent? She was doing her best at any rate, with a curious blend of cunning and artlessness. She even, as she sat down opposite him, went so far as to hitch her skirt well up above her bony knees. "Where were you?" he asked, as grumpily as he knew how. "In the street." "What were you doing there?" "Talking to a friend." "Are you sure this was on the night of the murder?" "It's in my diary. Every night I record the events of the day in my diary." Maigret reflected that he himself no doubt also featured in this crazy girl's diary. Nouchi was one of those girls who fall in love with every man they see, the policeman on the beat, the neighbor whom they encounter every day at the same hour, the film star whom they have never met in the flesh, the notorious murderer of whom they have only read. For the time being, Maigret was the star. I can't tell you the name of my friend because he's a married man. Indeed, well, Bertha, serene little Bertha, with a cherry red hat, was also having an affair with a married man. So you were out in the street, not far from this building. Weren't you afraid your parents might see you? It wouldn't bother my parents, they're quite decent. And you claim you saw Gérard Pardon entering the building. He was dressed exactly as he was today, in the same raincoat and the same grey hat with the turned-down brim. He looked around and then bolted inside. What time was this? 7 o'clock in the evening. I'm quite sure of that, because the postman had just made his last delivery. Thank you very much. It's important, don't you think? I don't know. But surely, if Cécile's brother was in the building that night... Thank you, mademoiselle. Isn't there anything else you want to ask me? No. She stood up, still hopeful. She added, You can rely on me to help you all I can. I know all that goes on in this house. I could tell you. Thanks. As he went to the door, she brushed against him. He could feel the tension in her body. Won't I have to go to police headquarters to have my statement taken down in writing? Not until you receive an official summons. Au revoir, Chief Superintendent. Goodbye. And Maigret, having locked the door and put the key in his pocket, went down the stairs. Inspector Jourdan was still on guard outside the building. Maigret signaled to him to carry on and went off in search of a taxi. During the whole of lunch in his apartment on Boulevard Ricard Lenoir, his wife could not get a word out of him. He sat with his elbows on the table, scattering breadcrumbs on a cloth and champing his food noisily. These were all ominous signs. You can't blame yourself with this girl Cécile, she ventured, addressing him by the formal vous, as she was apt to do at such times. Had anyone else been present just then, she would have referred to her husband as the chief superintendent, or even, though this was more unusual, as Monsieur Maigret. Had he even noticed that he had just eaten a luscious crème caramel? No sooner had he wiped his mouth with his napkin than he was taking his overcoat, stiff as a soldier's cape, from the stand. She could tell from his manner that there was nothing to be gained by asking him when he would be back. Hôtel du Centre, Boulevard Montparnasse, he snapped at the taxi driver. It was a quiet little hotel, mainly patronized by regulars from the provinces, who intended always to come to Paris on a particular day of the week. It smelled of field in a savory sauce and fresh-baked cookies. Monsieur Monfils is expecting me. He's waiting for you in the conservatory. There really was a conservatory, or at least a glassed-in enclosure with a lot of greenery, a rockery, and a fountain. Monsieur Monfils, still dressed in deep mourning, his nose red and running, was sitting in a wicker armchair with a handkerchief in his hand, smoking a cigar. With him was another man, whose face seemed familiar to Maigret. Allow me to introduce my legal advisor, Maître Leloup. It is Maître Leloup who will in future be looking after my interest in Paris. The lawyer was as fat as Monfils was thin, and there was an ample glass of brandy on the table within reach of his hand. How do you do, Chief Superintendent? Please be seated. My client... One moment, interposed Maigret. I was not aware that Monsieur Monfils was in need of a lawyer at this stage. I'm here merely to represent his financial interests, I assure you. The present situation appears to be somewhat confused, and until the will has been found. How do you know that any will exists? Oh, come now, it stands to reason. A woman as rich and hard-headed as Madame Benoît, formerly Cazeneuve, would surely not fail to. At this juncture, Madame Monfils and her 5 sons erupted into the conservatory, the boys following one another in descending order of height. Please excuse us, murmured the lady, with a suitably doleful smile. We're leaving, Henri. We've barely time to get to the station. Au revoir, Chief Superintendent. Au revoir, Maître Leloup. You won't be staying on much longer in Paris, will you, Henri? The children embraced their father, one by one. The porter waited with the luggage. At long last they left, and Henri Monfils, having poured 2 glasses of brandy and handed one to Maigret without a word, began. I thought it my duty, Chief Superintendent, my duty to my family in particular, to consult a lawyer so that he could represent me in any future dealings with you. And Monfils' nose was running. He got his handkerchief out of his pocket only just in time. As he was doing so, The chief superintendent got up and grabbed his bowler hat, which he had put down on a chair. Monfils stared at him in amazement. "But where are you going?" "If Madame Leloup has any statement to make, he is welcome to come and do so in my office," retorted Maigret. "Good day, gentlemen." Henri Monfils was dumbfounded. "What's the matter? What's got into him?" And his legal adviser, leaning back in his wicker armchair and warming his brandy snifter in the palm of his plump hand, murmured reassuringly, "Don't take any notice. It's just his way. These police Johnnies don't like conducting the business through a professional intermediary. He was annoyed at finding me here. Leave it to me, and I'll—" He interrupted himself to give all his attention to biting off the end of the cigar which his client had presented to him. Take my word for it. The early editions of the evening papers, which had just come off the presses, ran pictures of the funeral. One of them featured Maigret in a prominent position on the edge of Cécile's grave, next to the priest, who was sprinkling holy water. If they could have seen Maigret, with his hands in his pockets and his pipe clenched between his teeth, lumbering down Boulevard Montparnasse with a thoroughly disgruntled air, stopping outside the movie house plastered in brightly colored posters, and, after some little hesitation, going up to the box office and handing over some money, they would have been very much astonished. They being Jordan, pounding the beat outside the house in Bourg-la-Reine, where lights were beginning to show in the windows, the head of the Sûreté, speaking on the telephone in his office, and wondering what on earth to say in reply to the public prosecutor's questions, and Madame Maigret, busy polishing her brass. Having bought his ticket, Maigret obediently followed the usherette, in her black silk dress with the Peter Pan collar, as she led him, shining her flashlight up the narrow stairs. "Excuse me, excuse me, excuse me." He squeezed past the row of occupied seats, uncomfortably aware that he was creating a disturbance and treading on a great many toes. He had no idea what film he was seeing. Booming voices, seemingly coming from nowhere, filled the auditorium, and on the screen a ship's captain tossed a girl onto his bunk. "So you came here to spy on me? Have pity on me, Captain Brown, if not for my sake, at least for—" "Excuse me," whispered a shy little voice to the right of the chief superintendent, and Maigret could feel the woman next to him pulling something from under him. He had sat down on part of her coat.
Precocity. Precocity. Now, the state of being or tendency to be precocious, exceptionally early or premature development, as of mental powers or sexual characteristics. Chit. Chit. Now, a young and silly girl. Luscious. Luscious. Adjective, of food or drink, having a pleasantly rich, sweet taste.